Okay, you're good to go.
I'm coming to you from Columbia, Missouri in the US, where I'm an assistant professor in the School of Natural Resources. So today, just to give you an idea of what we're going to go through, we're going to talk about some of the things to do before you give a presentation. I think the overall message that I want you to take away from this is not to wing presentations. So the key to giving a good presentation is to plan ahead of time, make sure you're prepared, practice it, be comfortable with it before you even get to the conference. So I think that's the first message, is just to give you a little scare in how long it can take to put together for the first time a good presentation. So this is just kind of a general idea of preparation time. So if you're a master's student, it could take you 6 to 10 hours of prep time to put together a good poster or a good presentation. And a PhD could be anywhere from 10 to 17 hours. So again, not something you do the night before you get to the conference or on the plane on your way there. And you can tell, you can usually, I'm sure we've all been to conferences and seen talks, and it becomes pretty apparent, the people that, have practiced it and it's smooth and polished, and the ones that were thrown together. So basically the plan, I think, to put together a good presentation is to start off with, kind of a literature review, right? So you're reading while you're preparing a presentation and understanding what came before. You've got to, be comfortable in summarizing your data, and then you've got to organize your talk, right? So you want it to be logical. The goal is to start, with an outline that has 1 or 2 take-home messages. So I'm presenting today, for an hour or so. I'm aware that you're all going to phase in and out of my presentation multiple times. We only have a very, very short attention span. And so you don't want to overwhelm your audience with too many messages. You just want to have 1 or 2. Can anyone kind of maybe give me a show of hands, either with the icons and thumbs up or physically, of how many people have given a poster before at a conference? Awesome. Okay, what about a verbal or oral presentation, like a 15-minute conference presentation? Okay, so we span the spectrum, it looks like. So yeah, so those of you that have given many of these, some of this might be review, but for some of you, this could be the first time, and you might be nervous about giving a presentation. And so one of the best ways to deal, I find, with nerves is to be prepared and to practice. I definitely used to be very nervous about giving presentations, but I'd say by like presentation number 50, they just kind of dissipated. And now I honestly don't get very nervous about giving presentations. So I think it is a practice and just training and the ability to be comfortable talking about your research subject. So your goal in a good presentation is to be, focused. Again, if you have those 1 to 2 take-home messages, kind of like writing a paper, right? Often, you should write out those messages and then stick them in front of your computer on the wall or something, and then keep referring back to them as you're putting together your presentation to make sure you're not going too far off base and that everything revolves around the messaging you need for those 1 or 2 take-home messages. The other thing that is really nice to have, and I'm sure we've all seen this in conferences, is to have it on time and effectively paced, right? So we've all seen that presentation where you can see their slide, and they've got like 60 slides and they're on 10, and everyone's aware there's like 3 minutes left in their presentation time. And so then they just rapidly fire through them all, and you've lost your messages kind of at that point. So I think it's key to practice it to make sure it is on time, and then shorter is always better, because you want to be able to have time for questions. I mean, the whole point of going and sharing and communicating our research is to get feedback. And so if you deny yourself that question period, then you're losing out on one of the best experiences of being at a conference and giving a talk. And the other thing, with practicing and being prepared is to not have things go wrong, right? So I'm sure we all have nightmares, or maybe it has happened to you, where, presentation's gone wrong. So does anyone want to share a story of the worst thing you've ever seen or maybe experienced that has happened during a talk?
I have one, but it was a presentation I saw,
which was a Venn diagram of 5 overlapping circles, which was shown for a total of 5 seconds. And then we went to the next one. I thought that was quite the peak.
You didn't fully embrace the messaging on that one.
Not even slightly.
I've seen people fall off the stage before. That's hard to recover from. There's physical things, and then there's preparation things. And so again, being prepared and scouting out the scene and making sure your attire is appropriate and you're not, wearing super high heels that you fall over from or something like that, could help. Anybody else that got a good story of, or your biggest fear even, what's the nightmare you have the night before you give a talk of what's the worst thing that could happen?
I guess for me, it would be just complete mind blank. You forget exactly what you're going to say.
So you're standing up there and nothing's coming out.
Nothing's coming out. I've had that nightmare many times.
But it's never actually happened, right?
No, just in my dreams.
Yeah. So again, I think, having practiced it, one of the things I do is, if I'm flying somewhere or traveling, I'll record it onto my iPhone, and then play it back to myself. And so you don't want to have it, memorized, but you can be comfortable with your transitions. At that point, what slide's coming next. You generally have an idea of what you're to talk about in that slide. And so it's kind of that smooth thing. And then it helps with the timing as well. So yeah, something like that, and practicing might help you with that fear of not having anything come out. Anybody else have any really good stories?
Well, I wasn't there, but my friends were telling me they were at this big conference a couple of years ago, and they had made all their PowerPoints. And then when they got put onto the computer, because it had like a different version of PowerPoint, like none of the images showed up on their PowerPoint. So they had to present their talk without any of the plots or images. Yeah, so that sounded pretty rough.
Yeah, no, we're pretty dependent on our slides, though I think one of the messages, again, too, I want to get across today is a talk is not a collection of slides. You want to be able to have a story to it. And then that has actually happened to me where the AV just completely crashed, and you have a certain period of time to give your talk. And so I went to the chalkboard. It was actually a little freeing because everyone just believes you. Right? So you're like, and this is this beautiful figure where there's this awesome relationship between these two things. And, with no data in front of you, that was the general story, but it was, you were able to kind of tell it without getting into the weeds and the details. And so I think that's a good thing to keep in the back of your head, right? So have you practiced it enough, or are you comfortable enough with it that if the AV was to completely crash on you, could you keep going? And so that gets to that, having to practice it, or as I said, record it and play it to yourself. There's a lot of confidence building in doing that kind of repetition. So one of the first things that you need to acknowledge before you give a talk is who's your audience. And so this is going to change drastically between whether or not you're giving, say, a job talk to faculty of which there's no limnologists present, right? So you have to keep it at that high upper level, or you're giving it to the public, or you're giving it like at a Gleon meeting or ASLO or any of these other meetings where, everyone in the room is an expert, and you can, go straight into jargon. And so knowing this frame helps you kind of organize and decide how you're going to, what kind of stories you're going to tell in your talk. So if they're experts, you're obviously going to spend less time with background, and you're going to have more figures and data. If they're non-scientists, you really need to watch your jargon. And so if you're going to use a term like stratification or something, you need to define it. And, it really helps to have conceptual diagrams or some kind of figures where you can walk them through some of the more complicated terminology or aspects. So you want to, avoid highly detailed data. Non-scientists probably really don't care how you built your model or what your statistics look like. They want to know what that overall general story is. And so the little things that I do when I'm speaking to broader public audiences is if I use a figure from a paper or something that I made for a science audience, I'll replace the axis titles. So instead of saying chlorophyll A, I'll say phytoplankton. right? Or something, so we can get away from that jargon and maybe complicated units, and you can just get that overall message across. As I mentioned, conceptual diagrams go a long way. I find it really helpful to kind of build them. So in PowerPoint, right, you can have, your one slide with an image, and then the next one, you can have another image appear and another image appear. And so as you build your Venn diagram or your diagram of the lake, you can do it piecewise and walk your audience through it. And then hopefully they can keep up with some of those concepts. Another really popular way, and if you've taken any media training, a way to talk to the audience and talk to the public is to use metaphors or analogies, right? So everyone might not understand all the science or the lake concepts, but everyone understands, if you put it in something that we all experience in everyday life. So a good metaphor goes a long way. And then of course, there's the classic, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So if you can say it with a diagram or an image, then that's so much better than having text. The other thing that, we'll go through is to have as little a text as possible. So this slide I'm showing right now kind of has a lot of text actually. You want everything to be kind of bullet points and try to keep it as simple as possible. You don't need to have whole long sentences. Again, there's lots of literature and theory out there about how long people pay attention and what they're grasping per slide, and you would be amazed at how little, in fact, it is. It's likely that no one is reading every word on your slide when you're giving your talk. Also, this might be tough for the modelers and the audience, etc. But if you're talking to non-scientists, it is best to try to avoid equations or anything, really complicated. Again, you can replace some of those things with images, conceptual diagrams. So instead of, having something really complicated for phytoplankton, you can just have a green circle and everyone, might be able to follow along with you there. So it does, this is a lot of work to take, what we would have for publication and put it into this type of talk. And so again, you need to understand what type of talk you're giving and who you're giving it to decide how much time you need to spend on this type of thing. So if it's a larger audience, you tend to need to be, a little more formal. You likely, won't be interrupted in your talk. And so, you'll be able to time it and pace it. But if it's smaller, you want to kind of go for that less formal and have some more interaction. So things to think about in who's your audience is, what are their positions? What are their roles? What are their interests? You want them to take something away from your presentation. So you want to kind of know what they are there to learn and try to provide that for them. And then, as I said, be jargon aware. You're going to lose everybody on slide 2 if you immediately start jumping into, mixing dynamic jargon, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to try to keep it simple for that type of talk. Does anybody have any questions about that in the audience? I see maybe should I deal with the questions now in the chat?
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Switch on my video. Okay, no, yes. Yes.
We can see you.
You said little text, but me as a non-English speaker, having some text is very important because already your velocity of speaking is quite fast for me. So I'm so happy if I can read something. And therefore, I think the message, for me, the message is to have a certain balance between a lot of text and little text. Because as a non-English speaker, I read a lot, but I'm also trying to listen. So the text for me is very helpful. And I always try to have, I would not say a lot of text, but it helps a lot because if you mess up a sentence, and this can really happen because you're nervous, then you have the sentence and the sentence is fixed and well done. So I think that's a problem for the non-English speakers with
That's a great point. Yeah, and obviously, so English is my only language, and so yes, that is not something I've had to deal with. But you're probably correct on that, and it's easier to read than it is to keep up with the pace of speaking, right? So yeah, so that would be a know your audience situation. So if you're in that situation, then you're right. Text would probably be really helpful. It's a good point. Somebody else asked about balancing.
I have another question.
Yep.
My another question is, I don't know if I understood well. Do you have, well, okay, now I have the problem. Is it your opinion that you should have the first slide that gives an overview of all the thing that you will present? Would you see that that's useful?
Yeah, so I think it's useful if you can do it well. So we all know how to write science, right? It goes introduction, methods, results, discussion.
Oh.
And so a title slide that says those words is not particularly helpful, right? Because we all know that's how it should go. But what you could do is, instead of saying, then I'll talk about the results and blah, 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 is actually give the information. So, from a teaching perspective, I always go with the philosophy of like, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. And so that repetitiveness. And so you could start off with, what you're going to talk about specifically. What are the results? What is that big finding that you want everyone to figure out? And so, there's a really good writing book actually on writing science that talks about, we're not writing mystery novels here. This is not a whodunit. You don't need to leave, the good stuff to the end. And so, sometimes if I'm feeling particularly bold about something I'm talking about, I'll put it on the first slide. I'll say, and then I'm going to prove to you how, cyanobacteria are blooming in the winter, for example. And then that's, drawing everyone's attention. And so either they don't believe you and now they're paying attention to your methods and as you, carry the story through, or, they understand what you're going to say, and then it's easier for them to see how you got there. So I think an outline slide with the actual information is really helpful. And so then you've laid it out ahead of time, then you walk them through the details, and then you bring it back around, kind of that, as with writing, we want to kind of have that hourglass approach to things. So yeah, that's a nice way to do it if you do it well.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then there's a question in the chat. Can you tell us more about balancing images and the lack of text with accessibility for our language? And so is that, I think we've just dealt with that perhaps. If your audience is not English speakers or you are not, then it is probably really helpful to have more text. And certainly, now with Zoom and these things, when I record things for teaching, it adds closed captioning for me, my software that I have available for my students through Panopto. So that's also really helpful to be able to have that closed captioning if you can post it for people to watch later. Any other questions? Okay, so this is a great book that I read. I've taken some, formal training in science communication. I have a citizen science or community science program, and so we do a lot of talks to the public. And I found this one really helpful. So, the ivory tower of academia, we should be trying to communicate so that our audience understands what we're talking about, not overwhelm them with our jargon and things that they're not following. So again, know who your audience is, figure out what they're there to learn, and try to provide it for them. So things that you think they're interested in. So if I'm presenting to somebody local, I'm going to try to use a case study or an example of the local city lake, for example, things that they can connect and relate to. If I'm presenting at a global basis, nobody probably even knows where Columbia, Missouri is, and so I'm not going to go into that level of detail. So kind of try to tune it for your audience. And I recognize that, the first time you guys are, if you're students putting this together for the first time, you're not going to be able to rejig things. I often give talks multiple times. And so every time I do it, I can kind of, modify it for the audience that I'm presenting to. And so the other thing, as we mentioned, time is important. So make sure you're aware of how long you have and how long that question period is. As I mentioned, you really are doing yourself a disservice if you go through the question period. That is the most informative part of the whole thing. So, one of the questions is always asked is, how many slides do I need for, say, a 15-minute presentation? And so this maybe goes back to our text versus images discussion, but a general rule of thumb is about 1 slide per minute. So if you're giving kind of a typical 15-minute conference, it's usually 12 minutes for your talk and 3 minutes for questions. So you're going to want around 12 slides. You also don't want to overwhelm things. People can only take in so much information. And so I really try to keep it to one figure per slide. And so, if you're talking about a paper, for example, you've probably got 6 figures in your paper. I think your presentation should probably only have, 3 of those figures, maybe not all 6. So you need to further distill the information down to be able to make it tangible for your audience. And I already talked a little bit this, using animations to kind of build complicated figures. So bringing them in piece by piece. If you throw, one of those diagrams we love to do, say it's the carbon cycle or something, and there's arrows going everywhere and all kinds of things, it's going to take your audience, the whole minute that you're on that slide just to figure out what they're looking at. Whereas if you can, start with one group and then add the line, where the carbon's going and build it as you talk, then you might keep them more engaged. And so, yeah, from an English speaking perspective, I would recommend bullets only. But if you think, you're not communicating things well enough in that case, then I can see the need to have more text. Also, every slide should have a title. Again, everyone's going to be, checking their phones, looking away, and then coming back up to your talk. And so if they've lost track of where you are or what you're talking about, your title, like, mine says now, let's talk about time, is the ability to bring them back to where you are. And again, I think it could be more effectively used than just saying results. Tell them what the point of the figure is. Right? So you've got your figure up there, but then the title could be something like, climate change is making lakes warmer. Get right to the punchline, so they don't have to think too hard. One of my advice for writing and for presentations is, not to make the reviewer's head hurt. So make it easy for your audience. Let them, relax during your presentation. They shouldn't have to be figuring out all these really complicated things. You should try to make it easy for them to be able to understand what you're talking about. And then, I kind of mentioned earlier, some of our worst fears is things like falling off the stage. So one thing you can do to prevent that is become familiar with the room or the technology in advance. So, if there's a day when we all go back to conferences, I usually like to see a talk in the room where I'm presenting. You can figure out, is there a microphone? How are they keeping track of the time? Some have the automated, red, yellow, green system. Sometimes, the chair is standing up to give you your time. Knowing all of those things in advance, it takes away from the nerves. And it also helps, prevent catastrophes. Also, know yourself. Do you need a microphone? If anybody suggests that you should wear a microphone, wear a microphone. I've been to so many conferences where someone is like, can you hear me? And like half the audience is like, and then they keep going. Get the microphone, use the microphone, make sure that everybody can hear you. And if it's a really, really big room, you might have to, don't deny the technology that is available to you. Try to use it when it's there. Also be aware of things that, could trip you. If they've got some horrible setup where the cord, to the PowerPoint projector is running right across the stage, know where that is and try not to trip on it. I recommend getting out from behind the podium during a talk. I think it's, more engaging for the audience if you can move around. There is some exceptions to that rule. I gave a talk at an SIL meeting in China a couple of years ago, and it was one of these giant lecture halls where they were videoing you on a Megatron, and then you appeared on this giant screen behind. It was the biggest thing. And every time you moved, it delayed the video. And so I did go and watch the first person do it and watched how horrible that looked, right? The whole thing, every time they moved, it was delayed. It was so distracting and no one was really paying attention to the science at that point. So in that case, after seeing that happen, I was like, I'm going to stand behind the podium and I'm not going to move around. And it went well. So, there's any number of scenarios of where we have conferences and what those setups look like. So being aware of those things, seeing a few people talk in the room before you helps you understand, how you can best deliver your presentation. Think about, which way you need to turn to look at the audience. They say good advice is always to look at the medium that your audience is looking at. So as opposed to, using your mouse or something on your screen and looking at that laptop on the podium, it's usually more effective to turn around, with a pointer or something and actually point to the screen that your audience is looking at. That helps engage them in that material. Also, with the slide issue that Doug mentioned and things, there's often a speaker ready room. I recommend you use it. You can make sure that your technology is working, understand how the audio is working. If you have any videos, test it all and make sure it works ahead of time. And so sometimes this means, going to the conference a day before. Often if things start on a Monday, the speaker ready room is open and available on the Sunday. And so I always try to, well, there's always issues, there used to be, with flights and travel things. So I always try to ensure that I'm at a conference at least 24 hours before my talk to avoid, issues with things like that, if you can. So we mentioned, that 1 to 2 messages. So think about what the point of your presentation is, right? Are you teaching? Are you presenting research? Are you entertaining? Knowing what that audience is there for helps you give them the talk that they're interested in. So 2 important kind of functions of having objectives and having an objective slide in your presentation is to focus them on the purpose of the presentation, right? I'm sure we've all seen presentations where at the end of it, you're like, what did I just learn? What was that even about? So, putting that right up front, say, today, I'm going to prove to you that this is important, or, I'm going to explain how this works. So letting people know what that is, and that keeps you on message as well. And as I said, reduce complicated message. So, think of putting those phrases as you would talk to a layperson. An exercise that I like to do with my grad students in my lab is have them explain their thesis in like kind of an elevator pitch concept, right? So the couple of minutes it takes to be in an elevator without using jargon. So that the average person on the street is like, oh, I get what you're doing, and I can see how that's important. So you need to kind of remember how to keep things simple. I know it's a complicated world, whereas you become grad students, you've just learned all the jargon and the technology, and you're able to talk at those levels, and now you need to bring it back down for the layperson, and that's part of the learning curve, I think. It's very rare now that I would give a really detailed science talk. Majority of the talks that I give are at this kind of high level. And so it's a skill if you're going to continue in academia, that's worth learning.
Just a quick, I guess, point there as well is so I always found it confusing when people use US people use the term grad students, because we don't have that term like in Ireland, or it's not quite so common in or in Europe and stuff. So just in terms of jargon, I was just thinking like that was something it took me a while to figure out. Oh, that's what you mean, a grad
That's
student.
one I was unaware of. Yeah. And the secret here is I'm not even American. I'm actually Canadian, if you've caught my accent yet. But we call them grad students there too. So how would you refer to graduate students?
PhDs or master students.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yes, but yeah, that's in Ireland anyway. I can't speak for Europe.
Yeah, no, it's good to be aware of all these things. We make assumptions. So yes, I'm speaking of, the first time you're learning your own science and then communicating it at that level. So I've talked about, kind of taping your presentation and things like that. All of this is because it's really easy to go up and script your presentation and read it. But as I mentioned, the best presentations are where you're walking around, you appear natural and somewhat spontaneous. So I really recommend at the master's and PhD level, not using notes anymore. So again, having, what I'll do is I'll have the notes in my PowerPoint and I'll talk to myself out loud as I go through it. Sometimes I'll tape it. And then, when you go through that enough times, some of the words stick. And you're able to kind of give it. So it's not memorized word for word, but you are familiar with everything and you know the point that you're trying to get across. I'm sure we've all seen that presenter who gets up and shows a figure, and then they're analyzing the data as they're standing there in front of you, right? They're like, well, look at this figure. Well, that kind of looks like that. And I could see, you should know the overall message of the figures that you're showing to your audience. Standing in front of an audience is not the time to look at data for the first time. So you want to kind of, know what's coming, know what you want to say about everything, but not have it, memorized or scripted. Does that make sense? Familiarity, I guess, would be the key. And I've mentioned a few times already, practice is key. So, that's great that you guys within GSA already have this format to practice your presentations. In my lab group meetings, we have all the students practice sometimes multiple times before they go to a conference. And so this is also back to that preparation. So in order to practice it with your lab group prior to the conference, you need to have it done, at least a couple of weeks before you get on an airplane. So knowing this in advance, you need to take these deadlines and kind of walk them back so that you're well prepared. So as I said, after you make it, run through what you're going to say. Force your family or roommates or whatever to listen to you, go through it. It is different saying things in your head and saying them out loud. And so that can kind of help, with if you're concerned about, the English language barriers or things like that, that could also maybe help with that, is knowing what you're going to say and practice pronouncing things. So yeah, out loud, I think, is key. Yeah, and someone said, I usually memorize the first 2 slides to get over nerves and then let it flow. So yeah, that is also good advice. You want to, start off professional. Again, we've all seen those talks where the person gets up and says, oh, I hope this goes well. I just threw this together last night. I haven't slept. Here we go. And already you're starting off on that non-professional tone, and the audience's expectations, have been lowered. So, often you hear fake it till you make it. So even if you threw it together an hour before and you haven't slept, don't tell your audience that. If they figure it out, so be it. But put on that brave face in front and pretend like this is the best talk you're ever going to give. And then usually, yeah, adrenaline moves you through the rest of it once you get over that first hurdle. So again, don't stray too far from those messages or the objectives, and make sure everything in your talk, this applies to papers as well, relates back to those objectives. And so I read a great writing book once by Stephen King, and one of his favorite quotes is "kill your darlings," which sounds awful, but we often spend a lot of time making what we think is the perfect figure, right? The perfect Venn diagram, whatever it is. And it may go really well in a paper where people have time to sit and look at it. But sometimes you don't have the time in a presentation to do it service. And so sometimes you have to kill that darling and recognize that it's, it might look beautiful and you might be so proud of it, but it might not be helping to tell the story that you're there to tell, in which case you're going to have to cut it. One thing I often do is have a bunch of slides after my presentation of things that I cut. So, it's really awesome if you get to the question period and someone asks a question and you have a slide that answers their question, right? Have you looked at this? And you're like, bam, here it is. Yes, I have. So, it doesn't have to go away completely, but maybe move it down for, more detailed conversations in the question period than in part of your talk if it's not directly relating to your objectives. The other thing that we need to remember is your talk should be interesting. So as I said, it's unless you're presenting to a bunch of other modelers or statisticians, nobody needs to see that far in the weeds, typically. So even though that's the part that you find interesting, I think one of the things of knowing your audience is questioning what they find interesting. And it's not often the same thing. So make sure, when you give it to roommate, partner, whatever, if they're like, I didn't understand that and it was really boring, listen to them when they give you that feedback, because maybe it's not appropriate for the talk. And again, maybe a paper is the best place for it. I see talks as the highlight reel of a scientific paper. So it's not all the details, it's just that high level, this is the message that I want you to go away with. So don't overload the audience. Don't give them too much all at once because you're going to lose them. So a bit about structure. Title, and this applies to papers too, should arouse interest, right? It should be relevant to what you're talking about. And it's, kind of fun if it's a question or if it's something controversial. You want to kind of, one of the things we have to do as scientists at big, busy conferences is sell our talk, right? So people are only going to be scanning through the titles to decide what talk they're going to go see. And so your title is the way you draw in the audience. And so you don't want to disappoint them. You don't want to have a title that suggests you're talking about something that you're not, because then they'll show up expecting to learn something that they won't learn. But also, you want it to be fun. And, one of the popular things now is to have the semicolon, right? So something catchy, semicolon, what it's really about. And so that's a kind of a good way for papers and talks to get those messages across. We talked about this already, but if you have an outline slide, I would suggest not calling it intro, methods, results, conclusions. Instead, give them what the results are going to be and an overview of the methods you used, etc. So tell them those things up front and in advance. I think every good talk should have a slide where you define your objectives and maybe even the hypotheses of the talk. So again, make it obvious, make the title of the slide the objectives, or something, so that when people look at it, they're like, okay, I know what I'm going to learn here today. And then at the end, obviously, you should answer the question or the objectives that you posed. So again, you want to, have an hourglass. So start off broad. And if you're going to open with climate change, you need to end it with climate change. So you want to kind of bookend how you're framing your talk. So at the beginning, you want to grab your audience's attention, right? This is where your first couple of slides should be addressed of like, this is why this is important, and this is why you should care. So that's kind of your, case studies, or try to draw it to, something that happened. So I work on harmful algal blooms. And so usually my first 2 or 3 slides is about a harmful algal bloom in Toledo, Ohio, that caused 500,000 people to lose drinking water for 4 days and cost over $4 billion, right? Those are effective messages that get to the general public. You've got the social aspect, you've got the financial aspect. This isn't some really detailed thing that happens in the bottom of lakes. This is something big that we should all care about. So kind of keep that messaging broad and impactful at the beginning, because you are trying to draw your audience in and keep them there. The middle of your talk obviously should be the meat. This is where you prove everything that you said you were going to talk about or address. And then, as I said at the end, you want to make sure you summarize it for your audience, because again, they might not have attached all the links, and it's your job to tell them what the story is. They shouldn't have to try to figure it out for themselves throughout your talk. And then you could also, leave it somewhere where you're going next, right? So, as master's and PhD students, you're likely not done with your research subject. And so it's nice to kind of leave a teaser or something about where the research is heading or what the unanswered questions are. Any questions about this? Okay, so as I mentioned, a really good talk should not be a collection of slides. The focus should be you. You're the expert. I know it might not feel that way all the time, but you actually know more than anybody else in the world about your thesis subject, right? You know your study system, you know your methods, you are the expert. And so make sure that you're, again, not standing there reading off your slides, that you're actually talking your audience through what the slides are saying. So I mentioned this already, but a good mantra is tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And so it might seem repetitive, but that is the way people learn. And as I said, they're often distracted in conferences or exhausted, right? You could be the 5 o'clock talk and they've been sitting there since 8 a.m. So don't make their brain hurt. Make it easy for them to understand what you're talking about. Another thing that I often say to my grad students about posters to keep in mind is that most poster sessions are happening in the evening at the end of a very long day of talks, and they tend to have a bar. And so personally, I'm not usually in the mood at that point to have some detailed, discussion of statistics, right? I just want to have, what's the gist of the poster? Am I interested? If I am interested, I will ask more questions about the details. But first you have to drag me in, right? So there's a really good video that kind of walks us through what it's like to have a poster at a conference, at a big conference, for those who haven't seen it. And I'll have the link in my slides, but it's really funny. And you realize, when people are walking and scanning by, you really need to grab their attention and have them come to your poster first and foremost, right? If you don't have their attention, then they've not seen it. And, all you've got is the abstract and the abstract book. So we do need to kind of keep things as entertaining and light as possible, particularly for posters, I would say. And I've talked about this already, but try to not interpret your data on the fly. You should have a very good understanding of what your data says so that you can communicate it effectively. And then, for confidence or for nerves, fake it till you make it. So start a beat, as somebody mentioned, if you memorize those first couple of ones, then you're feeling confident and good, and then you can keep going through the rest of them. So try not to make excuses or act negatively right from the beginning, even if you feel that way. Try to have this portrayal that you've got it all together, and this is going to be the best talk we've ever seen. So don't apologize for being underprepared. And I'm not going to play this video, but we're going to put the link up to the slides on the YouTube channel or some way, so you can watch it on your own. But I went to a conference a couple of years ago, and there was a great plenary by this Randy Olson about the ABT framework. And so it's something that I follow and have my students follow when they're preparing presentations. So ABT stands for and, but, therefore. So as scientists, we tend to give talks that are more of the and nature, right? And I went out to the lake, and I collected this data, and I did the statistics, and here's the results. But to make it a story or more of a narrative and more interesting to your audience, if you have, and I went to the lake, but our assumptions about this turned out to be not to be true, therefore, we need to reconsider how we approach this issue. So you want to have it more of that narrative concept. And so, yeah, I'll leave the link for the YouTube video because it's about 10 minutes, but it's great to go over that. And of course, there's this book that goes along with it. So Randy Olson used to be a scientist, and now he's all about communicating. And so he's got a good perspective on what we think people want to hear and what people really want to hear. So I'd encourage you to watch that. Another thing that does matter is appearance. So again, this goes back to the fake it till you make it. If you're dressed confidently and you're feeling good, then you're going to likely deliver a better presentation. One of the things that is very helpful, and when I took teaching training, this is something they make you do, is video record yourself giving a presentation and then watch it, which is horrible, but it helps you become aware of annoying habits. So, are you a person who tucks their hair behind their ear 5 times every minute? Are you, playing with things in your pocket? Are you fiddling with things? Do you have, some snapping thing, or I don't know, everyone has their tics or their things that they do. And being aware of, the things that you can improve upon help you avoid them. So it's already been mentioned today, and it has been written on every feedback I've ever given on a talk, is that I talk too quickly. I know this. I attempt to deal with this. Some suggestions for that are to drink, or have some water or something so that you can slow yourself down. So you stop, you take a pause. If it's a science talk, I try to do it maybe when a figure's up, right? So give audiences that couple of minutes they need to figure out what that figure is showing. Stop talking, be quiet for a minute before you pick up pace. A lot of us tend to accelerate as we go through the talk. And again, if you're not prepared or it's a bit long, you start freaking out because the time is ticking by. And so it's helpful just to be, again, prepared and know what you're saying so that you're not rushing towards the end. So yeah, giving anonymous feedback. So when we do these practice presentations in my lab group, we write down things like this and give anonymous feedback back to the speaker so they can become aware maybe of some of the things that they do. How often do you say or ah during your presentation? And again, if you're aware of it, then you can start to help avoid it or mitigate it. Try to, as I said, maintain confidence. Fake it till you make it. So try to, stand up straight, don't slouch, etc. As I said, if you are able to, and you have a microphone that allows you to move, I would get out from behind that podium and walk around and refer to the big slide behind you so that your audience is looking at the same thing that you are. And act professional. So even if you blow your time and something happens at the end, try to maintain your professionalism and not freak out, right? It's happened to all of us. Everyone has blown their time in a presentation. It is not new. Everyone in the audience has been there and done that. So they'll be very kind to you. And so you just need to kind of keep it light and try not to get too upset about things that go wrong during your presentation. So as I said, with your voice, if possible, make it natural and relaxed. Speak slowly, but you also don't want to be monotone. So if you can kind of vary your speed to emphasize certain points or use inflection, that can help to let people know, what's important. We've all seen that great speaker who they throw up a figure and they're like, now this is really exciting. And I swear everyone in the audience puts down their phone or stops looking at the program and they're looking up and they're paying attention to that speaker at that point in time. So you can use things like that to try to keep your audience with you. Definitely, try to keep pitch low, shows confidence. I have been accused before of what is called the Canadian woman syndrome, where we tend to have inflections at the end of our sentences. I didn't even know it was a thing. Apparently it is. Now that I know about it, I try to avoid doing it. So it shows that you're not confident, right? So instead of saying, the lake is green, I guess sometimes we say the lake is green, and it implies that we don't know what we're talking about. And so knowing or being aware of these things that are sometimes cultural helps you to kind of avoid them. Because most of the time, I do have the confidence. I don't know why the inflection is there, but I think it's something that we inherently kind of adopt and learn. So try to avoid that inflection at the end of your sentences. Avoid upspeak. So again, if you're going to say it, make sure you're confident of it. And this often happens when you're figuring stuff out for the first time, when you're standing in front of the podium. So again, if you have those messages clear, then you'll be more confident in delivering them. And as I said, let audience have time for pauses. Pauses are okay, especially when you've just put up a really complicated slide that you want everyone to kind of figure out. And that's another thing, depending on who your audience is. If it's more public general audience, then you probably need to explain your axes and, what kind of figure it is, how you're, displaying this. If it's a scientific conference, probably not so much. But you're going to need time to let people take in what you're showing them. In terms of body language, and I know this is very difficult now on Zoom, so I have your faces on one side, but my camera is here, and so I'm trying to look like I'm looking you in the eye, but your images are not where my camera is. So as best you can, make eye contact. Hand gestures help, right? Whether it's virtual or in person, if you can kind of show things by using your hands in a non-distracting way. And again, that's something you can test out on a test audience and they can let you know if it's too much or too little. Try to smile. You might be terrified and it might all be horrible, but put on a brave smile and your audience will be engaged with you as long as you're looking like you're having a good time. Try to avoid, distracting, playing with things in your pockets, etc. Make sure the audience can see the screen. So I said to move around and get out from behind the podium, but don't stand in front of what they're looking at so that they can't see it. So sometimes you have no choice and you just got to kind of work with the setup that is there. But hopefully, you can be in a place where they can still see the screen and you at the same time. If you are going to use a laser pointer, use it effectively. Some people, you see it and you put it in their hand and every word, everything is got a laser pointer on it. It's meant to highlight important things or bring people's attention to like a figure. So if you're going to use a laser pointer, don't use it the whole presentation. Use it at those key moments when you want to be able to explain a figure or something in detail. And so, yeah, as I said, get out from behind the podium. They are where presentations go to die. Any questions so far on presentations? I'm going to get into question period now.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
What, video? Yes, okay. The thing with move around, I do not fully agree, because when people walk around like a tiger, I feel very distracted by this movement. I prefer having a person behind the podium that looks into the audience than someone that it's moving from left to right, from right to left. So I think the point here is, also when you are standing or sitting behind the podium, you have to look to your audience. You have to get this eye contact to engage people. So, and when I see that someone is walking around while talking, this is for me very distracting. So I don't know how others feel, but I think the most important point here is not to be fixed on the screen and talk to your screen, but you have to talk to the audience.
I agree. And I guess it's a good balance, right? And that's the distracting mannerisms that people could tell you. Yeah, pacing like a tiger is not what I'm referring to when I say move around while you're presenting. So that person might be overdoing it, right? So I think you can move effectively, but so in a 15-minute presentation, I think I would cross the stage 3 times. So not constantly. But yeah, not distractingly.
This is not moving around. This is just, but I think we understood each other. Another thing is with details. I understand and I agree with you that you have to give the big picture during the presentation. But I saw or I see a tendency that people hide also details. They tend not to show what they did with their data. So I prefer to have some short lines about statistics. They don't have to say it, but having these little details is very helpful, because otherwise I only have to trust the person. But if the presenter says, I did linear regression, then I understand what happened to the data. But if I only see a nice slide with some nice picture, graphs and statements without knowing from where the results came from, also this, I find this very disappointing. So I would add that we can also put some short sentences that we do not say, but they're there, and give the additional information that the audience can read, but it's not necessary to say.
Yep, I agree. I think that's exactly right. I guess I'm just trying to avoid the statistical tables. No one needs to see all the p-values associated with everything you did. But I agree, a sentence that says it was a linear regression is perfectly acceptable. I've seen some presentations where they go into like, oh, and then it wasn't normally distributed, and then I did this, and then I did this. And, we just need to know at the end of the day, you ended up on a linear regression or whatever it was. So yeah, but I would say too that a presentation is the highlight reel of a paper. And so, if people are looking for those level of details, if there is a paper, ideally, you would say, go there for all of it. and the level that is needed. But yeah, it depends on what you're presenting on. Sometimes statistics are key, and you don't believe the results without understanding how they were done. And sometimes, everyone can see a graph and see how things look higher or different or whatever you're trying to communicate. So it would depend.
Okay, thanks.
Somebody's asking about additional tips on virtual presenting. Yeah, we're all learning that. I don't know, I guess, so I teach like this, I teach an online class. And I think, some of the key things is to have 2 screens. I actually have 3 screens here right now. So I have my presentation is displaying on the one in front of me, which has the webcam. So I'm looking at my slides while I'm theoretically looking at you, and I have your images there too, so I can see who's asking the questions or what the audience's reaction is. And I do appreciate, thank you, having your webcams on. It's more difficult with my undergraduate students who often do not. And I can't tell if they're laughing, if where are they there? Nobody knows. So yeah, it helps for that. And then I have a second screen over here where I've got the chat open and, kind of the technological components that I might have to deal with. So that's one thing, having multiple screens, definitely trying to stay engaged with that webcam, wherever it may be. You might have to reposition it somewhere. And then making sure you have good internet. So this morning, my internet died right before I logged in. So I can hotspot off my cell phone, which is what I'm currently doing. So having a backup for your internet also helps, I find, making sure things go smoothly. But you've probably all given virtual presentations by now. Has anybody else got some good advice on that? The one thing I don't like, I've given some larger webinars where I can't see the people, and I didn't enjoy that as much because I had no idea who was in my audience, right? So typically when you go in, to a conference or whatever, you can scan the room, who's there, and what, maybe they're going to be interested or learning, or what level of jargon you can use. And so, yeah, some of the webinars I've given, the host has got it all otherwise, and I don't see anything. And so I don't get any reaction from the audience, and I don't know what they care about or what they want to hear. So I've not enjoyed that component of it. And the other thing that's pros and cons is often these things, as this one, will be recorded. And so you have no idea who's going to watch it after the fact, right? So, I know who's here now, but I don't know who's going to see this, in 2 weeks. So yeah, I've had some conversations with colleagues, and they're like, oh yeah, I saw your talk on that. And I'm like, you did? How? And they've, watched it later after it's been recorded and posted somewhere. So yeah, this is a bit more permanent than we're used to giving in our talks. This will probably be out there for a while. So, there's a bit to that. But also, I've been asked to give a similar talk as a guest lecture for classes. And now if I'm busy or whatever, I can say, oh, it's already a YouTube video. You can go and watch it and show it to your class that way. So yeah, pros and cons. Christine has a question.
Hi, yeah, so I have a question about formal versus informal when presenting and still remaining professional. I feel like there's some pretty strong opinions on this, even for wearing jeans versus wearing dress clothes, or cracking jokes versus not cracking jokes. So I feel like this is a very broad question. But do you have any suggestions on how to remain professional while still being informal? That's just how I think I am naturally as a person. And sometimes it's hard for me to bridge that gap smoothly.
Yeah, I'd say from an attire perspective, it depends on where you are. So a Gleon meeting or most scientific conferences, jeans are perfectly acceptable. And, all the bigwigs in the room are probably dressed lower down than you are. So, usually we don't worry about it. But if you're going for a job interview and giving a talk, or, it's to a more formal audience, like a public presentation, then you're probably going to want to be a little more professional. I think the humor is tough. Everyone says you should use humor, but not all of us can pull it off, right? So I don't formally have any jokes really ever in my talks. Sometimes things slip out as I'm talking, but usually I haven't planned for those because I'm still nervous of an inappropriate joke or bombing the joke, or, it's another level of like, professional, can you pull off a scientific talk and can you be funny? I mean, that's a lot of pressure. So yeah, I would say whatever your personality feels good about doing would be wise. Some people are awesome and you see their names in the program and you don't even care what they're talking about because you're going to go because it's going to be funny and entertaining. But not all of us can do that well. So I would say know what you are comfortable and not comfortable doing. Ted has a question. Uh-oh.
I don't have a really a question. I have a comment, right? So this is perfect that it's entertaining questions and I have a comment. I will say that the drinking water is a great way to slow down. It's a great way to pace yourself. If you feel like I'm going so fast, hold on, let me take a second. But what I would say is I usually drink out of these big wide mouth bottles and you can spill water all over you. And I have. And then that's super distracting for you because you're like, does the audience see me? What about the person in the back? Do they feel the water dripping down my belly button right now into my pants? I don't know, and then you get distracted. So I have gotten a lot of water bottles with the built-in straw, which really helps a lot. And it's also like a weird, I don't know, like toddler thing where you kind of suck on something. You're like, okay, I feel good. This is good. This is a good place. I'm cool. And then move on. So I really appreciated that because that's something that not a lot of people do, but it's an easy way to slow down. No one notices 1 second or 2 seconds for you drinking. Yeah, it can go a long way as long as you don't spill water all over you.
Yeah, and I do recommend water. I did that to myself once where I had hot coffee and I kind of forgot. And I was talking away and I took a giant swig and, kind of started spluttering a bit. And that wasn't great either. So water is wise. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I guess kind of going back to the virtual aspect of things, managing like silences in like virtual presentations, like, yeah, I guess that's something I find quite difficult when presenting virtually. Like you said, you don't know if you're getting any response or any, like, and then you're kind of just, you just become really anxious about this radio silence. And then you're kind of, it's hard to kind of pick yourself back up again. Is there any kind of, I don't know, recommendation?
Yeah, that's the hardest thing for me about teaching in particular. And, so I'm an assistant professor, so I get student teaching evaluations and I have peers come in and they evaluate. And so they always say, I don't wait long enough. I don't let the silence go on long enough, that you need to make it awkward for the students so that they will say something. So I think that's different if you're teaching than if you're giving a scientific conference. Again, most of the time you have a strict period of time, right, to give the talk. And so, yeah, as the silence is going on, you're watching the clock tick and you're like, oh man, this is going to mess the whole timing up for me. So I think, again, it depends on the medium. But yeah, I often try to, it's kind of maybe a 3-series approach. So you put it out there, you let the silence sit for a little bit, then you give them a little teaser, like a little hint towards things. And then, if it's to the point where nothing is happening, I even teaching sometimes I'm like, it rhymes with, like fill in the blank, like I'm making this so easy for you, just say something. And then sometimes you just have to call it and give them the answer or the response and move on. So yeah, you got to play it and it's situation specific. Any other questions? Okay, so you've made it through your presentation and now you're in that 3-minute question period. So a few tips and tricks. This is often, the most intimidating part, right? Because this is what's not scripted. You don't know what's coming at you. So one thing that is good to do to kind of kill some time and allow your brain to double process is to repeat the question so everyone can hear it. So it's good from a technological perspective because sometimes the person sitting in the front row and the person in the back row can't hear the question that was asked. And so they're out of the conversation. So it's good to do regardless, but also while you're repeating it, you're clarifying that you understand the question, and then the question asker is kind of nodding, yes, that's what I'm looking for. And you're also buying yourself some time to come up with the answer. So that's usually a good default thing to do when you're in a question period. Try to answer questions in the most straightforward manner you can. If the answer is, I don't know, then say, I don't know. Don't try to, make up something on the spot. It is likely someone in the audience will realize, that. And it's perfect. That's why we do science, because we don't know what the answers are going to be. And so it's perfectly acceptable. People like to be complimented, right? So it doesn't hurt to be like, wow, that's an excellent question. I'm gonna, go back right after this talk and look that up. They want to know that they're helping you and that they're giving you some feedback that is useful. So show that you acknowledge the feedback and you're going to, do some more homework or follow up on it. So try not to be condescending. Even if a question, is stupid, never frame it that way. Always try to answer it, and, be respectful of the person asking the question. If it's something controversial, don't argue in a conference. I've seen it. It's not pretty. Nobody needs to be yelling at each other across a conference room. If it's something contentious and the person asking it is someone who's looking to pick a fight with you, just agree to disagree and suggest you discuss it later over coffee. And that usually, shuts them down and allows you to move on. Because usually it is, maybe only the two of you care about the consequences of that conversation. So try to move it out afterwards into the hall. And as I mentioned earlier, it's great if you can anticipate some of the questions that people might have and have slides prepared that allow you to answer those questions. So don't cut your slides, just move them to the end. You never know when you can bring them back up again. All right, so just a few little things on media. So we're going to most people use PowerPoint for both posters and oral presentations. It is really helpful. I'm not a visual person. I actually hate making posters because I don't care what color it is. I don't care about the details. And so it really helps to start with a template, not a blank page. So every time anyone in my lab makes a poster, we have a shared folder where we have all the posters. And so if you look really closely at the hallways around my lab, they've all got a similar template and format, and people have just modified the color scheme or the organization. So I would recommend that, starting with a template and not a blank PowerPoint. Try to be aware of color blindness. So if you're going to have different symbols, if you're going to have them as different colors, make them also different shapes. So something that people can distinguish that's not solely based on color. A good thing for, to know how well this can be perceived is to print off your talk or your paper on a black and white printer and see if you can still tell the difference between things, because that's what it's going to look like to someone who's colorblind. As I mentioned before about the statistics table, I try to avoid having tables in a talk. No one's going to take in those numbers. And this is another example where you've seen people that they've got this beautiful, perfect table, but it's, 20 rows and 30 columns, and there's no way you're getting any of it when they put it up on the slide. So if I do tables, I'll do it like with text. So instead of saying what the p-value is, I'll write in significant, so people can say, okay, that was a significant effect. Great, moving on. So anything that is a table, if you can make it a figure or you can make it images or text, it's probably going to be easier to communicate to your audience. So this is that video that I mentioned that was viral about a year ago, where there's just one large main figure in the middle of the poster. And then there's like the details are on the side. And then in some cases, it's QR scan code that can go to all the details. So that's got the funny little blurb on what it's like to go to a conference and how you need to get people's attention. So I encourage you to watch that. And I think the exercise of boiling down your entire poster to like one main figure is still useful, even if you don't do it exactly the way they recommend. So knowing what your figure is, what is the one figure that proves the point of the poster, and making sure that's, you know, prominent and as big as it can be. So as we mentioned, for presentations, it's good to have, you know, that outline slide as long as it's got the details in it. You want to have anchor slides, so slides that kind of bring people back around. You know, sometimes my objective slide, you'll see it 3 or 4 times throughout the presentation, because I'm trying to bring people back to that messages. And yeah, if you have to start a slide by saying, I know you can't read this, but, then it probably shouldn't be part of your presentation, because no one can read it. So that's the, you know, put it in the paper, put it somewhere else, but it's probably not appropriate for this. Someone asked, what do you think about referencing in PowerPoint slides? Yeah, so I think that's useful. I think it can be a small box, you know, text down in the bottom right-hand corner. So, you know, it's great. And again, if you're at a big conference, it's complimentary for people to see that you're citing them and that you've read their work. Because otherwise, in the question period, the first question you might be getting might address this previous comment. How do you deal with this is a comment rather than a question? So you've you know, insulted the person who wrote the paper that you never cited. And so they're going to bring it up in the questions. So it's a good way to kind of show that, yes, I've read these things, I understand it, and you know, here's the citation that's appropriate for it. And so, yeah, in that case, just let the person have their time, make their comment, you know, say thank you, and then move on if it's more of a comment. And a lot of cases too, you know, as masters and PhD students, the people in the audience are trying to help you. They're training you, right? They're trying to give you some feedback or make you aware of some literature maybe you hadn't read. So try to remember it in that way. They're not typically trying to be aggressive. They're just trying to help. And so make sure you're, yeah, thankful to them for providing more information. Okay, so my last 10 slides here are just kind of a fun thing, which I'm realizing I might have to change now that we're all getting older. But there used to be a guy named David Letterman who was a night show talk host, and he used to do a countdown to the 10 biggest, you know, issues and whatever. And so these are the 10 biggest pitfalls in scientific presentations. So remember, this is what not to do. So the first one, number 10, is do not rush through all your slides, no matter what. And so, you know, if you're running out of time, skip them rather than trying to rapidly talk through them. Usually, if you've planned your slides well, you've got that summary at the end. Make sure you spend the time on that summary. So if you realize you're running out of time, flip through those figures and those results and kind of try to conclude it with the same amount of time that you spent on the introduction. So yeah, we all probably talk more quickly than we need to, and we're speeding up towards the end like that. You're not doing anyone any justice. No one's going to be able to understand you. So try to avoid that. So somebody's asking, should there be a thank you for the attention slide? Yeah, I usually have it. And the reason I do is because I have my email address there. So it's a helpful place for, you know, thank you. And maybe that's too a place to put all the citations or references. But also, you know, a good follow-up to questions could be, oh, and, you know, here's my email. Send me an email if you want to discuss this further, or I'll send you, you know, the PDF of the paper that this was about or something. So I think it's useful, if only to have your email there for your audience. And it's also helpful if you have a poster to have, I mean, business cards are kind of a thing of the past, but some way to contact you. And so some people will print out their poster just on an 8.5 by 11. And so have those there that people can take with them. So if they didn't get to your poster at the time, or, you know, you had already left or something, there's a way to contact you and follow up. So yeah, make sure that people have a way to get back on things if they're interested. All right, the number 9 thing not to do is not leaving time for discussion. So as I mentioned, timing will help, but you want to make sure that you're not rushing through things, and you want to get to that question period and have it be a useful question period. The number 8 thing not to do is not doing dry runs. So practice, practice, practice. You will be able to tune and fine, tune your presentation and get to the kind of the good stuff quicker, the more you practice it and the more you realize it. And there's always things that you trip over and nobody knows why. Like, there'll be a slide and a talk, and every time I get to it, I just kind of go blah. And I don't know why, and it's not working. And so that's when you just cut it. If for whatever reason you can't get through it well, that's an opportunity to kill your darling, so to speak. Number 7, not understanding what can and can't be achieved. So again, don't overwhelm your audience with data to prove it. As we give a presentation, the assumption is they're believing what you're saying. And if they want to see more details, they can read your thesis or the paper or whatever it is. So leave that kind of proof level things to journal articles and keep it to that highlight reel. Number 6, try to avoid using journal article graphics. As I mentioned, journal articles are usually detailed. They're usually black and white. The font is too small. And, especially the multi-panel ones that we tend to do, as I mentioned, you try to want to have one figure per slide. And so you need to kind of simplify and cut those down and in some cases replace the axis labels. Number 5, do not try to surprise the audience. Again, you're not building towards an unexpected conclusion. You need to be upfront about what your objectives are and what you're going to prove them. And there shouldn't be any, twists or turns towards the end of your presentation. So don't fail to develop insightful visualizations. And so again, everything should have that title and anchor and an overarching message. And so your figures or your visuals should support that message and that title of that slide. Number 3, not understanding how hard it is to gauge your audience. So as I said, knowing your audience is, one of the most important things to do right from the beginning. So try to pitch your story to the audience that is listening. Number 2, failing to put yourself in the audience's shoes. So again, you want to drop the jargon, you want to keep everything simple and know what they need to take away from every slide. And the number 1 mistake a presenter can make is thinking a collections of slides is enough. So, you're not done your talk when you've finished the last slide. You're done your talk when you've practiced it and you're comfortable with what you're saying. So with that, I'll open it up for kind of more general questions. So I see we've taken our time here. But yeah, happy to follow up on this and also my email. You can feel free to reach out if you have any further questions.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. That was brilliant. And I was just wondering, just before we do quick questions, if we could get like a screenshot photo of people just for.
Sure. So I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind stop sharing, and if people wouldn't mind turning on their videos if they can, and I'll see if I can take some sort of photo of everyone. So apologies if I've got you in a strange facial expression, but yep, yeah, I've got that. I've got a screenshot. So
great. Yeah. Any questions?
I did see there was one. I think Freya had put in the questions, but she talked. It was a bit earlier. She said, "How would you deal with this is a comment rather than a question?" Is that right, Freya, or was that answered?
Yeah, I think Rebecca touched on that.
Okay.
Just say thank you and move on.
Yep.
So I missed that one, sorry.
That's all right. It's probably the general advice. Thank you. Move on. Yeah. Wow, we dealt with it all in the chat here. Now I feel all this pressure. Next time I give a presentation at a conference, the expectation